Hey guys, how's it going? I would say it's good to see you, but I can't really see you. So I wanted to make a video to continue our study in Joshua here. We've been going through the book of Joshua with the teens on Wednesday nights. Really been a really good study. I've learned a lot. I know the teens have as well. And so what I wanted to do over the next few weeks, as of course we're limited in our ability to interact with one another, is take some time and really just go through, continue to go through Joshua. And after I teach through the lesson, I want to set up a Zoom call for 6:30 on Wednesday nights and get together with any of you that would like to join us. That may be teens. I would love teens for you to join us on this. But as well, we want to open this up really to anyone in the church who wants to jump on and discuss this, talk about how we can further implement these biblical principles in our lives, specifically with what we're dealing with in Joshua chapter 16 and 17. Today is what we're going to be dealing with. And so I would love for you to do that. And if you would like to do that, once again, I will post the Zoom information on our Facebook page. Of course, that is a closed group, but I as well will be sending this information out to all the teen parents. So we'd love for you to join us. Teens, you can download that app. Really, anyone can download the Zoom app on their smartphone and then just tap that link. Should log you right in to our meeting. You'll have to enter the meeting passcode, which I will give you that as well. But I really would love for you to join us and be a part of this. So right now what I'm going to do is we're going to just take a few minutes and go through Joshua chapter 16 and 17. We have been talking about Joshua and his conquest of course, the land of Canaan. Eric, I believe, was the last, had the opportunity last to teach, and he went through Joshua chapter 15 with us. And I really appreciate Eric and his going through that. I know he did just a tremendous job on that. And so we're going to continue today with Joshua chapter 16 and 17 in the next few minutes. So if you have your Bibles, I would invite you to grab one. If you don't, you can follow along on your phone. Or if you're watching this on your phone, you can grab something that you can view the text of Scripture with. If you can't do that, that's fine as well. Just listen to me, and I'll go ahead and read this for us. And then as I read it, we'll just kind of go down through the passage. We'll explain it and teach through it. And I trust that this will really be a blessing to you as we look at the Word of God and as we look at God's promises to us. Of course, God's Word is powerful and it never returns void. It always, after we encounter it and after we interact with it, it always leaves us changed in some way. And so I pray that that'll be the case here in the next few minutes. Joshua chapter 16, grab your Bibles. I have mine right here. I'm just going to go ahead and start reading down in Joshua chapter 16. This chapter deals with the allotments for Ephraim and Manasseh. The author starts out really considering them, we could say, one big tribe. He considers it the tribe of Joseph. Of course, Joseph was then, these allotments were given to his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And then the allotment to Manasseh was actually split up into two sections, East Manasseh and West Manasseh. And we talked about the allotment to East Manasseh a few weeks ago in Joshua chapter 13. That will be again referenced at the beginning of chapter 17 in a few minutes when we get there. Joshua chapter 16. The allotment of the people of Joseph went from the Jordan by Jericho, east of the waters of Jericho, into the wilderness, going up from Jericho into the hill country of Bethel. Verse 2, then going from Bethel to Luz, it passes along Adaroth to the territory of the Archites. Then it goes down westward to the territory of the Jephthalites, as far as the territory of Lower Beth-horon to Gezer, and ends at the sea. The people of Joseph, Manasseh, and Ephraim received their inheritance. And then verses 5 through the end of the chapter really deal with the boundaries of this tribe of specifically Ephraim it deals with. And then after it deals with the boundaries of Ephraim, in verses 5 through the end of the chapter, in chapter 17, we're going to deal with the boundaries of the tribe of Manasseh. So in verse 5 it says, the territory of the people of Ephraim by their clans was as follows. The boundary of their inheritance was on the east, was Adar as far as upper Beth Horon, and the boundary goes from there to the sea. Of course, to the Mediterranean sea we're talking about. On the north is Mikmethathoth. Then on the east, the boundary turns toward Tanath Shiloh and passes along beyond it to the east of Janoth. Then it goes down from Janoth to Adaroth and to Narah and touches Jericho, ending at the Jordan. From Tapua to the boundary goes westward to the brook Kenna and ends at the sea. Such is the inheritance of the tribe of the people of Ephraim by their clans. Verse 9, together with the towns that were set apart for the people of Ephraim within the inheritance of the Manassites, all those towns with their villages. And then verse 10 is a very important verse. It says, however, they did not drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer. So the Canaanites have lived in the midst of Ephraim to this day, but have been made to do forced labor. So here in chapter 16, I mentioned that there's a special favor or treatment here we see given to the tribes of Joseph. This was predicted back in Genesis 49, verses 22 to 26. If we turn back there really quickly, it talks about really just God's favor was given to Joseph over and above the other 12 tribes. It says, Joseph is a fruitful bough in verse 22. It says, verse 25, by the God of your father who will help you, the Almighty who will bless you with the blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep and the crouches beneath. Verse 26, the blessings of your father are mighty beyond the blessings of my parents, up to the boundings of everlasting hills. May be on the head of Joseph, on the brow of him who was set apart from his brothers. So these blessings will go up beyond to everlasting hills. And he kind of separates Joseph, saying he's going to get special favor. And we see this with the land that is given Joseph, as Joseph's, we could say, inheritance was greater combined with the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh with his sons than all the other tribes. So the land was larger than all the other tribes, but also it's right in the middle of the promised land. So the land would be considered by many to be the most fertile or the most beautiful part of the land as well. Some of Ephraim's cities in verses 5 through the end of the chapter were actually part of Manasseh's inheritance. And you have some overlapping of cities where you have cities that were in other territories or other tribes. We don't know exactly why that happened. In this case, it may have been because Ephraim, even though he was a second-born, was really got favored more by Jacob in Genesis 48. That's perhaps one reason. At the end of the chapter, in verse number 10, I mentioned that this was an important verse here. In verse 10, it talks about the men of Ephraim and how they failed to drive out the Canaanites. Now, this happened, we saw in chapters 13, 14, and 15, specifically where Judah failed, especially in verse 13, chapter 13, to drive out the Canaanites there. And it goes on to say that they did not drive out the Canaanites, and these Canaanites lived in Gezer. But the Canaanites lived in the midst of these Ephraimites to this day, and they have been made to do forced labor. This is likely because basically these men of Ephraim chose to disobey God, essentially so that they could get additional benefit, maybe additional wealth, from having putting these Canaanites to work for them, to do forced labor, maybe so that they wouldn't have to do as much work themselves. But the bottom line is that they failed to drive out these Canaanites as God had ordered them to. In Judges 1:29, it goes on to say that these Ephraimites refused to drive out these Canaanites, and Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer. And it goes on to say, even in Judges, so the Canaanites continued to live among them. And of course, that's important because later on, we're going to see that actually in the book of Judges, the Canaanites rise up and eventually overtake portions of or certain sections of the Israelites and actually turn the tables on them and force the Israelites to do labor for them. So here we have these Israelites who are forcing these Canaanites right now, at least in chapter 16, to do forced labor for them. The idea really of forced labor, the word is the same word that's used of the Israelites when they worked in Egypt. So basically they made them like slaves to do their labor, and also probably to pay heavy taxes as well. So they saw an opportunity to do what they thought was best, or maybe we could say was easiest in this case. Now, they probably had good reasons to do this. They probably thought that their idea was wise. They thought, as they kind of collaborated as what the best way to move forward in response to the Canaanites that were living still in the city of Gezer was, they probably weighed the cost and determined maybe that it would be too costly, it would be too hard for them to go forward. Maybe they even thought it's unnecessary to really go as far as having to go to war to drive out these Canaanites. They were going to lose probably lives in the process of doing it. In addition, you know what? They could get extra income. They could have put these Canaanites to work. It would work out best both for them, and perhaps they thought it would work out best for the Canaanites as well. We don't see any agreement being come to between the Canaanites and the Israelites here, which just simply says that Israel made the Canaanites to do forced labor for them. But in Deuteronomy 20, verses 16 to 18, we are clearly told that Israel was to annihilate the people of Canaan, not to spare them, not to subject them to forced labor, not to treat them as slaves, but to get rid of them, to force them out of the land, to completely rid them out of their existence so that they would not be influenced by the Canaanites. Now, because they refused to do that, we see consequences. These consequences are not seen immediately, but they do eventually come to fruition. In Judges, the Canaanites, as I mentioned, they rose up and enslaved the Israelites. The Canaanites also influenced them as they coexisted with them. They began to intermarry. And as a result, they eventually brought with them their false gods. They eventually started worshiping those false gods. So as they coexisted with them, the Canaanites' influence began to turn the hearts of Israel away from the true God. And basically, eventually, their refusal to drive the Canaanites out resulted in the Israelites basically being driven out. And God warned this. He said, if you refuse to devote these people to their destruction, to devote Canaan to their destruction, then eventually I will devote you to your destruction. And really spiritually, we can learn the importance here of obeying God all the way. Not half-hearted obedience, not an obedience that says, you know what, I'm going to pick and choose. We could say my battles with sin. No, that's not at all what God requires of us as believers. It's easy for us to tolerate pet sins in our lives. only to realize that someday we're going to pay the price. We're going to pay the price for the consequences to fail to choose obedience. Obedience over convenience. Obedience over what we think is right. Because a lot of times we may think that our idea is the right thing. But if that conflicts with God's idea of the right thing, we have to fall on God's thinking as the right way every time, or we will reap the consequences for our disobedience. Some examples: allowing a temper to flare up. Excusing it is just a momentary loss of control. It's really nothing. I just get angry sometimes. I let it flare up. I slam the door. I yell at my parents. And then what happens is eventually you end up hurting someone deeply, maybe someone you really care about, or perhaps a lot of times what happens is you end up deeply regretting an instance where just a momentary loss of control ends up putting you in a very difficult situation. You have to pay very grave consequences. You end up even going to jail as a result of a momentary loss of control because you thought that it was okay to let that sin reside in your heart. Excusing laziness, right? In an entertainment saturated culture right now, you have a lot of time on your hands, right? Many of us are home. We have extra time, and we find ourselves in situations where perhaps you are, we could say, more greatly tempted to waste our time, to be lazy with our time. We excuse it. You know what? It is what it is. I have a right to do this. And we don't really think of it as sin. We think of it as maybe just a weakness, instead of really being willing to drive out that sin of laziness from our lives. And oftentimes that can creep into and develop and get a foothold into our lives to where eventually in the future we end up not getting what we're supposed to do done. We don't complete an assignment in school on time because we end up just kind of being lazy. And eventually that could creep into your career as well, where laziness is seen in a workplace, and eventually you may lose your job simply because you allowed a sin to continually pervade in your life and you don't do the hard thing and eliminate it. Oftentimes it's little sins that cause us to miss opportunities. Things like selfishness, things like pride. Maybe an opportunity comes where you really feel deeply about sharing the gospel with someone, and the Lord gives you an opportunity to share the precious truths of God's word. And that person has seen the way that you live. Maybe he's seen your selfishness. He's seen the way that you kind of just control things around you, how you want things a certain way, you're not willing to sacrifice for other people. You're not willing to sacrifice of yourself. You're not willing to share love with other people. You think of yourself as really the most important person in the office by the way you act around others, the way you act with other people at your school. And in that selfishness, when you engage a person with the gospel, is going to come back and that person's going to say, you know what? You don't live like that. And it's going to harm. It's going to basically cause you to miss an opportunity to share the gospel because you are not living the gospel out. People don't see that you are serious about your sin. And that in itself is a great travesty. It's a very sad thing that you were going to lose out on opportunities simply because you refused to take God at his word and to get serious with your sin. We have to choose to deal with sin decisively. We've got to deal harshly with our sin so that we can really see victory in our lives, and also so that we don't feel the consequences of it in our lives. Now, those consequences, like I said, it may not come today or tomorrow, but the Proverbs is very clear. Your sin will find you out. Your sin will come back to bite you. God will come and he will give you consequences for your sin. It's just a matter of time. So get rid of it. Get serious with it. Don't let it fester. Don't let it just be an excuse of, I'm just weak in that area, or this is just, it is what it is. No, determine in your heart that you are going to confess your sin. That is to say the same thing that God says about it, and then you are going to forsake it. You're going to eliminate it from your life. Let's continue on with chapter 17. This talks about the tribe of Manasseh. Spiritually, we can learn the importance of obeying God all the way. And that is seen in the case of Manasseh as well. Chapter 17 of Joshua, I'm going to read down through the first 6 verses to start us here. Then allotment was made to the people of Manasseh, for he was the firstborn of Joseph, to Machir, the firstborn of Manasseh. The father of Gilead were allotted Gilead and Bashan, because he was a man of war. And allotments were made to the rest of the people of Manasseh by their clans. Abazir, Helek, Azriel, Shechem, Hepher, and Shemeda. These were the male descendants of Manasseh, the son of Joseph, by their clans. Now, Zelophehad, the son of Hepher, the son of Gilead, the son of Machir, the son of Manasseh, had no sons, but only daughters. Then it goes on to list the daughters, Mela, Noah, Hoglath, Milcah, and Tirzah. These daughters approached Eleazar the priest and Joshua the son of Nun, who of course they were the leaders, they were the one dispersing the land. The Lord commanded Moses to give us an inheritance along with our brothers. So according to the mouth of the Lord, he gave them an inheritance among the brothers of their father. Thus there fell to Manasseh 10 portions, besides the land of Gilead and Bashan, which is the other side of Jordan, because the daughters of Manasseh received an inheritance along with his sons. The land of Gilead was allotted to the rest of the people of Manasseh. So here we have chapter 17. This allotment was given to the people of Manasseh. And it says that this allotment was given because he was the firstborn of Joseph, probably implying that Manasseh was given this lot after Ephraim, because Jacob favored his second son, Joseph's second son, over his firstborn son. We talked about that already. And then verse 1 goes on to say that they were given the land east of the Jordan because this man, Machir, was a man of war. Machir was given the land east of the Jordan, not west of the Jordan. So this would have been the land that was divided in Joshua chapter 13. And it was given to him and his descendants as well. He's talked about as a man of war. In Numbers 32:39, it says that his descendants drove out the Anakites from the town of Goshen at one point. And so these people were fighting men, mighty fighting men. Also, in Numbers 32, verses 1 to 5, we have the statement that they had large flocks and herds. So they got this land, this large tract of land east of the Jordan because of, number one, it was the best land for their flocks and herds to graze on. And then also because they were mighty fighting men and valiantly fought on behalf of underneath Joshua in order to drive out the Anakites. And so they were rewarded with this land east of the Jordan. And then it goes on to say, verse 2, allotments were made for the rest of the people of Manasseh, that is west of the Jordan. So this would have been above Ephraim. The rest of the allotments were given to these 6 sons, these 6 male descendants of Manasseh, which each received a portion of the land. One of the sons, Hepher, ended up with no male heirs. He only had 5 granddaughters. And so basically they were at risk of losing their family's portion. Of course, in the societies during that time, in that culture, women were not landowners. But in this case, apparently there were no male heirs. So this family, initially they went to Moses in Numbers 27, verses 5 to 11. And what they did is these women went to Moses and basically asked him if they could continue to have their land, all right, that was due their grandfather. So they went to Moses, and then Moses in turn went to God. And in Numbers chapter 27, we have this occurring, verses 4 through 9. If you want to turn over there, I'll read that for you. It says, "Why should the name of our father be taken away from his clan because he has no son?" In other words, we are a family unit, just like these other 5 brothers. Even though we don't have a male heir, we should have claim to this land. So the daughters say, "Give to us a possession among our father's brothers." So Moses brought their case before the Lord, verse 5. And the Lord said to Moses, "The daughters of Zelophehad are right. You will give them possession of the inheritance among their father's brothers and transfer the inheritance of their father to them. And you shall speak to the people of Israel, saying, if a man dies and has no son, then you shall transfer his inheritance to his daughter. And if he has no daughter, then you shall give his inheritance to his brothers." So God went on here basically to say that he is going to establish a precedent. And this is really what God did here. He established a precedent that if a man died without a male heir, then the inheritance would go to his daughter in all cases. And then if there were no daughter, then a brother. If there were no brothers, then an uncle, no uncles, and the nearest relative is what the text goes on to say. But basically, Joshua here then is confronted by these daughters who said, look, Moses went to God. God promised us this land. So basically, you need to divide the land accordingly. Instead of dividing it 6 ways, now Joshua divided it 10 ways. So there are 10 different lots. So it ended up with Hephers, that is the 6th son, his family actually getting 5 times as much land as if he would have gotten with a male heir, because each daughter received a lot. And then each of the other 5 brothers received a lot. So 10 in all, 5 for the other brothers. So the grand total of portions of land for Manasseh were actually 12, 2 on East Manasseh, and then 10 in West Manasseh above Ephraim. Now it's important that we just take a moment and reflect on verses 3 through 6 here. Here are these 5 daughters who approached Eleazar and Joshua, of course, showed courage in doing so. But also, I think this passage teaches us that here God is declaring women to have the same value as men. And specifically, this passage is saying that they have the same value in regards to land ownership, but I would say in general as well. So in contrast to the societies around them that treated women as slaves, as servants, as inferior to man, God is saying here, women have equal value in his eyes. They have as much right to own land as a man does. That thought pattern, that idea or value that is placed on women, both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. And then we have in verses 7 through 11, the boundaries of Manasseh. And then verses 12 and 13, verse 12 says, "Yet the people of Manasseh could not take possession of those cities because the Canaanites persisted," or we could say stubbornly dwelled in the land. Now, when the people of Israel grew stronger, they did put the Canaanites to forced labor, but did not utterly destroy them or drive them out. So here in verses 12 and 13, we once again have the reality that the Canaanites refused to drive the that the Israelites refused to drive the Canaanites out. And that adds one thing that we did not see previously. It adds the fact that the Canaanites here stubbornly or persisted in dwelling. They stubbornly refused to leave, essentially. E.R. Clenenden notes, they had the power to remove the Canaanites from the land and so be God's instruments of judgment to remove wickedness. But they chose to tolerate it, to use it for their own purposes, what God had devoted to destruction. Just like Achan, they sowed their seeds of their own destruction. Peace with wickedness is preferred to war for righteousness. I think Clendenin ends with a great statement there that so often we find our society, and at least our Christian society, I think, really embracing, and that is, we're comfortable as long as we're in peace with our wickedness. In other words, as long as we don't have to make waves, we're going to kind of look the other way with sin in our own life and in the lives of others, instead of going to war for righteousness. And Clennon then here says, war for righteousness is what God demands, essentially. God demands that you go to war for righteousness, that you go to war against your sin. And then in the last verses of chapter 17, we see that God refuses to accept complaining and ungrateful attitudes. In verse 14, it says, the people of Joseph spoke to Joshua, saying, why have you given me but one lot and one portion as an inheritance, though I am a numerous people, since all along the Lord has blessed me? Joshua said to them, if you are a numerous people, go up yourselves in the forest and clear the ground for yourselves in the land of the Perizzites and the Rephaim, since the hill country of Ephraim is too narrow for you. And then the people responded to Joshua, saying, the hill country is not enough, and all the Canaanites who dwell in the plain have chariots of iron, and those in Beth Shean and its villages, and those of the valley of Jezreel. Then Joshua said to Ephraim and Manasseh, that is to Joseph's tribe, you are numerous, have great power. You shall not have one allotment only, but the hill country shall be yours, although it is forest, and you shall clear it and possess it to its farthest borders. And then you shall drive out the Canaanites, for they have chariots of iron, and though they be strong, in other words, you still are going to drive them out. So here we have God refusing really to accept complaining and ungrateful attitudes. The tribes of Joseph speak as one tribe now, just as chapter 16 started with Joseph's tribe as one. Here in verse 14 it says the people of Joseph spoke to Joshua, and Joshua actually responds to them in you singular. That's the grammar there. And it says that they were dissatisfied with God's choice of their allotted territory. And so what they did is they challenged God's servant Joshua. They felt maybe shortchanged. They felt like they had more people than other tribes. So they showed here that they were arrogant, and really they were greedy in their tone, as opposed to Caleb, who said, you know what, God promised me this city, and so please, basically grant me this city. In their request, they basically were challenging God himself and calling him unfair. They showed their fear of man by their response to Joshua's challenge to go and basically drive out the Canaanites. They said, you know what, they have chariots of iron, we can't do that. Really, they showed their laziness and ungratefulness in refusing to be satisfied with Joshua's response and saying, you know what, go and clear out the forest. So you have more land to be able to dwell in. And basically what Joshua is doing here, he responds at the end of the chapter with his own challenge to go, do what I say, clear the land, and make room for you, basically for you to inhabit the land and then conquer the Canaanites, just as God promised to give you the victory. Ultimately, we have to remember that God was giving them the land by lot. In other words, they were drawing lots for the land. It was by chance. And so ultimately the one who was giving the Canaanites the land was not Eleazar or Joshua. They were not choosing which lot the tribe of Joseph got, but rather it was God himself. So ultimately they were rising up against God himself and saying, God, you are unfair. We don't think basically that we got a fair deal here. And the reality is that oftentimes we take the same attitude with God. The Israelites were challenged by Joshua to act courageously, to have courageous faith in order to enjoy God's blessings. But even though the Lord had blessed them, as we talked about before, they had the tribe of Joseph, encompassing Ephraim and Manasseh, had the greatest and the most bountiful, the most fruitful land out of all the other tribes. And yet they still turn around and complain that they don't have enough. That's often how we are as Christians. We are just so ingrained in our culture here, especially in America, that we never feel like we have enough. And we feel like, you know what, if we don't get something that we feel like we need or want, that God is unfair. God requires that we go to battle spiritually and be willing to conquer our flesh in order to enjoy the blessings of spiritual victory. Too oftentimes we're content as Christians with the status quo, where we get upset when, just like Manasseh, when things don't go our way, we think we have the right to certain peaceful luxuries that we become accustomed here to in the United States. Maybe the internet is taken away from us, God forbid, right? Or your health, or even more mundane things like a cushy new sofa or a car, and we think we deserve this, and we aren't willing to really sacrifice for the advancement of the gospel, and we don't recognize that, you know what, life is not about the things that we think we need in life, but rather life is about what God tells us that we need in life. And so we need to be willing to go to battle spiritually, to be willing to conquer our flesh, to be able to get rid of sinful influences in our life, to be willing to eliminate and fight daily to take up our cross and to follow Jesus, to completely drive out whatever sin that we find in our life, and really to do whatever it takes to stop at nothing until God gives us the victory. And that's really what Joshua is ending here, this chapter 17 with. He's saying, you know what? Courageously believe, have faith that God will give you the victory. He's promised you his grace. He's given you great and exceeding promises. He's given you everything that you need to be able to have success in overcoming sin. You just need to be willing to go to battle. Yes, it's hard work, but you need to be willing to do the hard work. You need to be willing to do the hard thing and fight for the cause of Christ. And then you will see great victory in your life, and you'll see great fruit in your life. And the Lord will greatly bless you. Spiritually, I'm speaking. Spiritually, he will greatly bless you as you advance towards your calling that God has given to you to become more like his son as you advance in your spiritual walk before him. Let's pray. Father God, thank you so much for your word. I really ask that you would help us to believe what you say. It's really hard to have faith when we have the culture around us that is just hammering down our throats the fact that we don't need you in our lives. But Father, that's why we need you even more. Help us to understand and experience the reality of God and his grace and the victory that we can have as we overcome sin and as we engage in really in battle against the flesh, as we do battle against sin each and every day. Help us, Father, now to love you more and to share our love with others. In Christ's name we ask this. Amen.